The question is, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country?
For me, the principle that we work best when we work together, without coercion or conscription, bullying or bossiness.
Always whenever someone says, oh, peace and sausage, and it's a roll and sausage, and it's sausage roll, we're better together.
Well, they didn't. It was us. We invented it, just like every other bloody thing.
Well, that's very interesting.
We have very serious the referendum. It seems to me that they're not dealing with the issues.
Hi, if you've been fed up with most of the debate until now, the Scottish Independence Podcast is your chance to hear some different views on what the independence referendum means for Scotland. Hello, this is Scottish Independence Podcast number 5. And today we've got the second part of the conversation with Donald Adamson, who teaches political economy at the University of Cambridge and also sociology at the Open University. It was a really fascinating discussion. I think there's a lot there to get your teeth into, so I hope you enjoy it, and we'll have a wee word at the end. We just go straight into it this time, so be ready. If we go back to the more economic side of it, you know, there's, with the SNP for example, they're late with Salmond being an ex-banker, and they're often labelled the tartan Tories, particularly from Labour. They've often been labelled that, whereas everyone knows it's a bit of a crock, because it's quite clear that although they're by no means leftist, the SNP's policies have been for a while considerably to the left of New Labour, and in fact Labour have in a certain sense replaced the Tories as the right-wing party in Scotland, with all the corruption and sleaze that goes along with being the right-wing party in the country. But given a yes independence vote, what kind of economic systems can come in with the parties that currently exist or independently of the parties that currently exist?
Well, I'm not sure I'd wholly accept the premise in your question that the SNP is to the left of Labour. I think in some areas, but perhaps that's true in some areas of social policy. I think on economic policy, I don't think there's a great deal between the SNP and Labour. I'd also say that I'm as up as anybody else is for ridiculing Scottish Labour, but I think we do need to recognise that there are still some decent people left in Scottish Labour. People who are conceivably capable of being persuaded to support independence. But as far as the economic system is concerned, and I think one way to think about capital is that it's an economic system in which we produce goods and services for the capitalist, in exchange for which the capitalist provides us with a wage, so that we can buy back from the capitalist the goods and services that we produce for him in the first place. And I think there's certainly among many on the left in Scotland, there's a willingness and an ambition to challenge that. And I suppose the question then is, how do we challenge that, given the historical failure of social democracy in Europe, a failure that even dates in the early decades before the early decades of the Second World War.
When you say a failure, do you mean the failure of it to take control of the system, or are you talking about countries that nominally at least have a social democratic system, like Norway and Sweden and the Scandinavian countries, who generally seem to be doing better than some of the other countries in Spain and Italy, for example? Sure.
Yeah. Now, what I'm thinking of more specifically is going back to the early generations of social democrats in Germany in the 19th century. And many of them were people who saw social democracy as a means of creating the conditions for socialism. Of course, before we go very far into the 20th century, in the early decades of the 20th century, social democracy has already started to decline into a means of managing capitalism. And of course, social democracy continued its decline thereafter. In many respects, Keynesianism, what we call Keynesianism, only underlined that. And it was only a matter of time, given the collapse of Bretton Woods in 71, before Keynesianism itself collapsed. And I suppose what I'm anticipating, and certainly what I'm hoping for in an independent Scotland, is that although I'm not a social democrat myself, as I think I said before, I'm hoping that the left in Scotland after independence embraces a progressive social democratic agenda, with the objective of getting back to those early origins of social democracy, consciously seeing social democracy as a means of creating the conditions for socialism.
As a stepping stone to something better.
Well, sure, and I think this is important obviously in history of capitalism as well. This failure of social democracy. I suppose that does introduce lots of different areas. How you mentioned Sweden, and you could also discuss Denmark. I mean, Denmark, although it has a lighter regulation or regulatory regime on say labour, Denmark, like Sweden, does have a very strong corporatist tradition. Trade union densities of over 80% in some of the Scandinavian countries. Compare that to Scotland, about 25%, and most of that is concentrated in the public sector. And in Scotland, of course, public sector trade unionism is very much the last bastion, the last defence of trade unionism. And of course, if Scotland does stay in the union after 2014, obviously let's hope that doesn't happen, I think one of the areas that, particularly the Tories, but it may happen under Labour as well, will target is to weaken public sector trade unions. If that happens, obviously, that opens the way for a new wave of labour legislation, or anti-labour legislation, anti-trade union legislation. And I think Scotland could find itself, this would be another area where Scotland would find itself in an increasingly precarious position. But in terms of the kind of economy I would envisage, I suppose it would be broadly what's understood as a progressive social democracy. I don't think there can be any return to Keynesianism, though. Maybe it might be helpful to say a few words about Keynes, because I think his general theory is still highly relevant for us. But we need to be very careful to distinguish Keynes's arguments in the general theory from what we call Keynesianism. What Keynes effectively did in the general theory was to demolish much of classical economic theory. After all, one of the reasons he used the title general theory was to communicate his argument that the model that he developed in the general theory was a model that would be generally applicable to a wide set of economic circumstances. But the corollary of that argument was that classical theory was a special theory, that it was applicable only to a very specific set of economic conditions. And what happened under Keynesianism, under the so-called neoclassical synthesis, and maybe we could discuss that on another occasion, but this was effectively inverted. As Keynesianism developed under mainstream economics, Keynes's general theory became the special theory, and neoclassical orthodox mainstream economic theory was reinstated as the general theory. And what Keynes recognised, or one of the things he recognised in the general theory, was that capitalism was subject to periodic crises. And one of the causes of this, and one of the factors that amplified these crises, Keynes argues in the general theory, was what he called the marginal efficiency of capital. It's a very important concept in the general theory, and Keynes puts it to a number of different uses in the general theory. A simple definition of the marginal efficiency of capital would be it's the rate of profit that the capitalist expects from applying a capital asset to produce output, the income stream on investment, if you like. And of course Keynes recognised that as speculation became a larger and larger component of capital flows, so the marginal efficiency of capital became more and more unstable, more and more uncertain. Hence Keynes's well-known point in the general theory, where he tells us when the capital development of a country becomes the byproduct of the activities of a casino, the job is ill done, and the job that he's referring to is capital investment, or more pedantically, capital investment that's conducive to full employment.
So what do you think is the gap in the public conception of the Keynesian solution to that, and what the Keynesian solution actually is?
Well, I think Keynesianism became instituted as a kind of deficit bias, and what used to be called left Keynesians were just as responsible for this as in Britain's case, the UK Treasury. And I think some of the more engaging passages of the general theory, and then this gets back to your earlier question about the kind of economic system in independent Scotland, is where Keynes talks about the need for what he calls the socialisation of investment, because for Keynes, in a normal functioning capitalist economy, it would be optimal for somewhere between 65 to 75% of capital investment to be socialised. And for the remainder to be in the private sector. If you think about that, what we're actually saying here is, because we have to remember that Keynes was an apologist for capital. The general theory was written to save capitalism, or at least to save capitalism from itself. And I think the lesson for the Scottish left here is that here we have one of the arch apologists of capitalism telling us that we need to socialise investment in a capitalist economy in order to reduce the severity and regularity of capitalist crises. Because that, for Keynes, the key point here is that by socialising investment, you reduce the amplitude, the instability of the margin, you stabilise the marginal efficiency of capital, and it's precisely that process, and there are a lot of complex and convoluted processes that flow from that, the impact on interest rates and the impact on supply price and so on. But the overall impact is to stabilise capital. But of course, this is capitalist crises.
So this is one of the ideas you would like to see implemented as a step towards something else in an independent Scotland, or?
Well, this is one of the ideas that, again, it gets back to what we were talking about earlier with Eric Olin Wright and Real Utopias. I think one of the projects for the left more broadly, and for the Scottish left more specifically, is to create the conditions for capitalism by creating alternative relations of production within capitalism itself. Because what the left can learn from capitalism is learn from its success. What capitalism has succeeded in doing is naturalising its own relations of production. So competition has been naturalised, money making has been naturalised, the relentless cycle of working long hours for a wage, and of course mass consumption has been naturalised. And so deeply embedded is this naturalisation of capitalist relations of production that many people can't even imagine an alternative to it. I think Slavoj Žižek put it quite well when he said, it's much easier to imagine the end of all life on earth than it is to imagine a much more modest, radical change in capitalism. And I think he's right. I think for many people, even on the left, it's very difficult to imagine this more radical change in capitalism. And that's why I would put much more emphasis, as I say, as part of the project for the left more broadly, and the Scottish left more specifically, ideally after independence, in developing this, creatively developing the means to create alternative relations of production within capitalism itself. And that's how I would think of the socialisation of investment as one means of doing that. It's not a panacea any more than radical monetary reform is. I mean, I'd love to see the Scottish left distance itself from this whole greedy bankers narrative. Or put it this way, if we must talk about greedy bankers, let's not talk about greedy bankers in terms of the ephemera of bankers' bonuses and remuneration packages. If we're going to talk about greedy bankers, let's address the reality that a small number of large banks, effectively multinational corporations, have a virtual monopoly of the supply of credit.
Well, this is Bertolt Brecht. What is the robbing of a bank compared to the founding of a bank?
Yes, yeah. But that's the kind of greedy banking we should be addressing, and not the ephemeral fluff, if you like, of bankers' bonuses, because ancient Rome had a highly developed banking system. They were no strangers to greedy bankers. The same with Renaissance Florence.
I mean, the greedy bankers thing, changing the big bonuses, is kind of equivalent to getting shot in the head 5 times instead of 6 times effectively.
Sure, yeah.
With that kind of system.
Yeah. And as I say, the left also mustn't buy into this myth that monetary reform, even radical monetary reform, is some kind of panacea. And how I would fit monetary reform, radical monetary reform, into my thinking on this would be, again, to reiterate the point, to see radical monetary reform as part of the creating these alternative relations of production within capitalism itself. Because one of the reasons that socialism does seem so utopian to so many people is because it appears to be an abstraction from reality rather than being grounded in the reality that we experience in our day-to-day lives.
So you're saying it's difficult to imagine another system. how do you know, like the idea of having one country moving in a socialist direction, one of the arguments that's always given against it in the simplest terms is, well, you're pissing against the wind and you can't piss against the wind because the world's all moving in this direction. You know, like in Greece where they've got the crisis and there's the radical left that are trying to get voted in, there's the radical right.
Yeah.
And it's always, you know, you can't have the radical left because it will destroy all of the world markets. I mean, how real do you think that is?
Well, again, it comes back to the point that the